Well, good day and welcome to another episode of Three Guys in a Word. It's good to be among you once again and open up and continue our study in the Book of Ruth. We are entering in the last couple episodes, Lord willing, and it's been a good discussion so far. It's always great to be able to be joined together with two fellow brothers and further study the Word of God. We hope that you find these episodes uh, beneficial and that we're getting to know portions of God's Word that uh, may not be talked sufficiently about. And it's a good reminder that as we are looking at of late for quite some time now, books of the Old Testament, which are there for our instructions, and we just need to also very much study them and not just strictly look at the New Testament, but focus in on what Paul talked about presenting the whole counsel of God. But again, it's good to be with you, and it's good to see my fellow brothers, both Eric and Chris. Again, my name is Andrew, and just let's see how everybody's doing this morning. Chris, how you feeling?
Doing good. Living the dream. That's all I can say is living the dream. Good for us to have this chance to be together to open the Book of Ruth again. Hard to believe we're almost through it already. Gotten a lot of application lessons from it, probably more than most people would think from such a short book. But looking forward to continuing our study today and always enjoy our time together that we have to do this. How you doing, Eric?
I'm doing good, man. I living the dream. That's fine. We used to say that growing up, where I grew up, like out in the country, and it was kind of like dismissive sort of thing. Like, I'm fine. Like I just, I'm doing what I gotta do to get by. But I think it's taken on more of a positive connotation lately. Like it almost used to be said in sarcasm. But yeah, I'm blessed. I got a house over my head. I got a family that loves me. I got a lot of good stuff going on. So I got a million and one reasons to be thankful to God.
Just makes you think of that song, "Count Your Every Blessing," which one of our brothers likes to lead that a lot, and it's worth hearing. It's one of those songs, like servant song, that I personally could just listen at every or and sing, of course, every service and just every time we get together. There's some songs that I, speaking for myself, can really connect with, and I need to really count my every blessing, or and when I seek to count my many blessings, then that changes my disposition, and so an attitude of gratitude. It's always something to seek out and uh, fits well with what we are going to be talking about and what Ruth really presents, and looking to get forward into the next section here in just a moment. But before we do that, Chris, if you can remind us what our principal verse is for the Book of Ruth.
Our principal verse is Ephesians chapter 2 at verse 19, where it says, "Now therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God."
That is a beautiful thing that you can be where you were once not part of a community, and you were once uh, on the outside, that there's been an opening made available to you, and that you can walk on in and be part of a group, which of course God does for us today with his church. And it's just a wonderful thing. And as we like to do, and why don't we just take just a moment and just kind of rehash a little bit of what we talked about last time, and maybe something that came to you from those first 13 verses of chapter 3. I'll start with you, Eric. Just what stood out for you, or is there something new that just in preparation for today's discussion on chapter 3?
Well, of course, this is where the tide begins to really shift. Chapter 2, you've got Boaz showing kindness to her, but now Naomi's all about like let's set them up, and she just has a plan and she's gonna work the plan, and it's gonna work out. There's one phrase I think that was interesting that I don't know that we commented on last time, um, where it says that she wasn't. Naomi tells Ruth not to make herself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. Um, and I think that phrasing is really interesting, not making yourself known. It reminds me actually of Esther and Mordecai. Mordecai is kind of like withhold certain information at this time. So I just found that interesting, and I don't know that we commented on that. Of course, it's Boaz wakes up and he's like, "What? What? What's going on here?" Um, but just consistently, Boaz is portrayed as a very positive character. He's concerned about Ruth and he wants to make sure that there's no false impressions about her with all that's going on here. We talked about the value of customs last week and understanding the idea of uncovering one's feed and basically it being a proposal with weight to it. There's she gives this meaning of you're a close relative. She knows the things to mention, and Naomi has sort of informed her in this respect. And Boaz, being a true Israelite indeed, he's very familiar with this. um, and of course he says to her that he's got to check on something first. So this is just kind of turning up the heat, turning up the spice and sizzle a little bit. But it's like, what's going to happen? There's just a lot of drama in the Book of Ruth in a positive way. They can make, well, Hollywood has a terrible job of doing good things, but somebody who would otherwise be good at making movies could probably make a good movie out of Ruth. So, Chris, what stood out to you, man?
I think the whole kinsman redeemer thing's the main thing. One of the biggest takeaways of Ruth, just coming to the book, being familiar with that. I'll go through what I went through last week. Just talk about the kinsman redeemer briefly. He was responsible to buy back a fellow Israelite out of slavery, Leviticus 25, verse 48. He was responsible to be the avenger of blood to make sure the murder of a family member answered to the crime, Numbers 35:19. He was responsible to buy back family land that had been forfeited, Leviticus 25, verse 25. And then this is kind of where Boaz comes in here. He was responsible to carry on the family name by marrying a childless widow, Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10. So these are all these responsibilities that Boaz is going to have to take on. But like Eric said, and we talked about this last week, the procedure of it, he could easily just be like, yeah, sure, I'll do it. But he doesn't just do that. He's like, wait a minute, there's something I got to go check out. I got to go verify this. And if it's okay, then I'll do it. Which I think is ultimately, we've seen, I talked about this a little bit last night. You think of like character development in a book or a movie. The scriptures are kind of laid out that way too, where characters, individuals develop over time. With with Boaz, you have this man that sees Ruth, takes mercy and pity on Ruth, obviously was familiar with Naomi, but now his mercy towards her, I think, has grown into something else, where he's not viewing this just as like a service type of thing. Oh, yeah, I'll carry on your lineage. I think he really cares about Ruth and he really cares about Naomi. And personally, you read this, he doesn't have to do that. He doesn't have to take the compassion upon her. And with him being in that role of that kinsman redeemer, I think it's a perfect shadow of Jesus being willing to do things for individuals that don't deserve it necessarily, and always willing to go above and beyond. Boaz does far more than what was required of him by the law, and Christ obviously did far more than any of us deserve. So I'm looking forward to seeing I know the conclusion of the story. We all probably do, but looking forward to going through that and seeing that more in depth. We got Andrew.
Probably the person that she sort of has taken a step back, but we can maybe say that we learned the greatest from Naomi. You just see from what she began as this bitter, lost individual, lacking of hope, and uh, to now it's night and day, where she is, uh, in chapter 2, she is kind of like seeing blessings have been provided to her from coming back, and she's putting like two and two together, that God has not forgotten her, that God has indeed uh, blessed her, with uh, Ruth as being a loving daughter who is willing to really put herself out there. And you can imagine just Naomi just seeing all this, and uh, it's humbling her. And you like how chapter 3 begins, it's a perfect example of, okay, in chapter 1 she's consumed with, and we can empathize, sympathize when going through hardships, and we turn inward and we're dealing with a mentality, usually a victim mentality, and like the world's out like to get me, or the world has crushed me, and God, why you allow this to happen, type of thinking. And we deal with this and we struggle with this from time to time, and we want to know, like, is anything ever going to get better? And now here Naomi is seeking to, okay, I need to look out for Ruth. She um, uh, sacrificed everything to come with me. I mean, great illustration of Ruth being Christ-like. And I got to do what I can for her, if at all possible. And why don't I seek to get these two together, because they seem to be uh, compatible. And it's just amazing how you could see a just drastic shift in a relatively short time. And yeah, bad things happen, and we understand that. But here's just a great example of God making good out of a really difficult situation. And it's where if you put a step in the direction toward God, which uh, Naomi did, and of course Ruth did, he, in this instance, has greatly rewarded them. And I truly believe that Naomi's recognized that, and she's trying to pay it forward and do what she can. And so we're going to pick up in, oh, just one other final thing. I just wrote at the in chapter 3, I just wrote in my Bible, knowing and following the law, and just the importance of recognizing and how Boaz uh, knew that and displayed that, and that it wasn't just uh, everybody in the totality of the people in Israel at that time of the judges. Most people were not following and knowing the law as they should, as they were commanded to do. So Here was one of the exceptions to the norm. All right. Let's pick up in verse 14. And Eric, if you just go ahead and read just 14 through 18.
So Ruth lay at his feet until morning and rose before one could recognize another. And he said, Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. Again he said, Give me the cloak that is on you and hold it. So she held it, and he measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her. Then she went into the city. When she came to her mother-in-law, she said, How did it go, my daughter? And she told her all that the man had done for her. She said, These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said, Do not go to your mother-in-law empty-handed. Then she said, Wait, my daughter, until you know how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest until he has settled it today. All right, so this is kind of the sending her away and making sure that nobody's whispering. Of course, yeah, it's hard to make sure nobody whispers. Somebody's gonna be whispering, but Boaz is trying to do everything that he can to protect her and make sure that she's well taken care of. Now, at the same time, there's a little bit of irony because Ruth at the start of the day is just walking around with 6 measures of barley. It's like, well, where did she get that barley? Because everybody knows who Ruth is, everybody knows who Naomi is, so she's just walking down the street with 6 measures of barley, and she's been, taking care of Boaz's field. I mean, 2 and 2 make 4, right? So there's probably a lot of people who are looking at this like, Boaz, are you serious? Like, we know something's going on. Um, so I don't know. There's a little bit of irony in there for me, but um, that everything's on the up and up. They're not partaking of marital relations or anything like that. They're both just they don't even recognize each other at this point yet, except for by voice. And so it's sort of still kind of pre-dawn where this is going on. But yeah, I mean, by the time she gets home, I would imagine somebody's seen her walking down the road with six measures of barley. And again, this is just testimony to Ruth, and this is a pretty strong lady. 6 measures of barley is nothing to sniff at. So she's carrying this down the road and brings it over to Naomi. I don't know how far she has to go with it. But Boaz, he's just such a good guy. He's just that's that I don't know how else to say that. Like, he's just an Israelite indeed. He's the star in the darkest sky of Israel's history, because the time of Judges is awful, absolutely awful, and Boaz is like unimpeachable. And so to have somebody like this, there's even on the darkest of nights are still stars, and Boaz is still a star. Um, and then of course Naomi's like, she's like, he's gonna take care of it today. He's that kind of guy, She's just pulling for him too, and I don't know, like you could just imagine these girls all excited, and Boaz is just like, he's probably beating the streets too. Like he's going up, he's on his way to the gate. He's got his papers in hand, he's like ready to roll. I love the tension and the action and the drama. It all just comes like to a climax here, and then of course chapter 4 is going to be the resolution. So it's very exciting stuff. Chris?
Does y'all's translation have he took 6 ephahs of barley?
It says measures. There's no referent. So ephah or measure, 6 of the day and times measure. So ephah is probably right.
Because what I was reading on that, it'd be 120 liters of grain he sent her home with, which is a lot. Like you said, Eric, like she's walking through town with all that. It's like, where'd she get that from? She probably got it from Boaz.
Yeah.
Um,
She doesn't have just like a little basket she's holding on with 2 fingers.
so he measures that out and he sends that back with her. And once again, he's thinking about Naomi, thinking about her mother-in-law, thinking about making sure they have enough to eat. Um, and like you said, Eric, he really is I would say he's the star of the show, because the book's not the book of Boaz. He's not really the main character, but he's the one who kind of puts all these things in the motion. Obviously, God's in charge, God's doing this, but Boaz is a man who really kind of answers to the call. He goes beyond what the law expected. He takes the extra step when it comes to, as we're going to read in chapter 4, making sure that all the process is being followed. You know, you wonder how he felt during this whole process. He probably was kind of taken aback a little bit, but he really, I think, kind of maintains his composure. It's like, here you go, here's this. Go home to your mother-in-law. I'm going to go take care of whatever needs to be taken care of. And like you pointed out, Eric, which he says, Naomi says, he will have this matter concluded at the rest of or by this day. But I still wonder how Ruth kind of feels, because she doesn't know for certain that it's going to be Boaz. It could be somebody that they don't even know who it is. So I wonder if there may, for her, on her part, been some type of anxiety or worry of, what if it's not Boaz? What if it's someone else? Because I think you can definitely tell from her interactions that she wants it to be Boaz. She wants Boaz to be the kinsman redeemer. And Boaz wants to fulfill that obligation, but he wants to make sure that he does it in the proper way, which once again comes back to us. Um, Eric, you're going through Leviticus, talking about the Levitical law on Sunday nights. Following the procedures of the law was an important part for them in this day and time. And like you pointed out, with it being the day of Judges, not very many people cared about following that. So that's what one reason with Boaz just, is just this bright light. Naomi comes back from Moab. Here's Boaz, who's this bright light, who God puts in their lives and really changes their lives, as we're going to see as we continue throughout the rest of the book. But I really like what he says in verse 17, do not go empty handed. He wanted to make sure they were still taken care of. And I think he probably would have still cared about them very deeply, even if everything didn't work out the way that it does ultimately, which talks a lot about his character, because he's not really getting anything out of this so far. But going above and beyond for people, I think it's ultimately what we're called to do too. What you got, Andrew?
Well, I was thinking of, even though that nothing has been promised, and it's certainly not a done deal, but it's almost thinking of like a dowry, in a sense of, okay, here's a gift, or potential promise of my hand in marriage, to the parent and of the daughter. And so that just came to my mind. And also just how our cup overflow. Of course, this is a physical cup you're talking about, or physical means here, but and of course, the spiritual matter is when our cup overflows, and that we are provided truly with what we need, and so much more. And we do see God here providing well beyond the means for Ruth. But you can imagine spiritually that their cups are overflowing, that things are working, and things are improving drastically from how they had been when they were in a distant land, and when they were among a people who were not their people, and now that they are among uh, the God's people, specifically uh, a servant of God, and Boaz, and that just describes him to a T, and a great example for us to go above and beyond. And it just shows that, as verse 18, how important it is to handle things with immediacy when things that can be construed in you just can imagine it's a small village, and how quickly something, if not handled, it would spread like wildfire.
Mm.
And you would need to address it immediately. For example, of like, okay, you can imagine Ruth being among the maidens and how they would react with everything that was going on. Just the whispers and the gossip, and uh, Boaz being a godly man is going to do anything to squash anything about rumors or getting any ill will being demonstrated, not only to his direction, but certainly not going to make it to where both Naomi and certainly Ruth be ostracized for trying to be subversive or doing anything that is uh, not on the up and up, and making them have a bad name, and or he having a bad name, that he's such a man of integrity, and that uh, the woman is being maintaining purity in this instance, in this instance. And something I'll need to look up. I don't know if it is. It's just referenced a couple of times, that the word known, and I don't think it would be the same word, but it could be. That whole notion of knowing is directed toward intimacy in at the beginning of the book of Genesis. But that's probably not the same word because it's used in a different instance. But it just did make me think of when you knew somebody in sense of the uh, Old Testament, the usage that designated intimacy between a man and a woman. And so we're seeing that it has not happened yet because it's not yet ready to happen, and it was only going to happen once it's the appropriate time. And so that just made me think of that, because there was nothing done that was wrong in that instance, even though some people may think that, and it may be presented as questionable of what happened um, that night. And we discussed that last time, that there was no um, immoral activity that occurred during that time. And so, just like how he just takes immediacy to what needs to be done, and that there is even further hope being built up in this situation. All right, Chris, if you could read verses 1 through 6 of chapter 4.
It says, now Boaz went up to the gate, sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, come aside, friend, sit down here. So he came aside and sat down. He took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here. So they sat down. Then he said to the close relative Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, sold the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. And I thought to inform you, saying, buy it back in the presence of the inhabitants and the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, then tell me, that I may know. For there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am next after you. And he said, I will redeem it. Then Boaz said, on the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance. And the close relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. You redeem my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Boaz is like a master negotiator. Starts out by talking about the land, and hook, line, and sinker. The relative's like, yeah, I'll take the land. I'll do that. Yeah, there's a catch though. But once again, I think it is extremely important to note this about Boaz. He goes to a public place. He incorporates more people than just him and this other relative in this conversation. So nothing could be twisted or construed. These two people could solve this dispute amongst themselves, but Boaz wants to make sure that it's done appropriately, that it's done rightly. I think that there's a a lot of benefit in him calling these 10 elders of the city to sit down and listen to this as well. Nothing could be misconstrued. Everything would be verified. I do think it's interesting that the nearest kinsman's not mentioned by name. We don't know who it is. Um, one thing I was reading up on this is he basically calls the guy Mr. So and so in a way, because there is no name. His friend comes sit down. Uh, so you kind of wonder what the closeness is of Boaz and this individual too. Were they distant to him as well? Um, it doesn't really tell us, but there it is with the land thing that we had talked about with the kinsman redeemer, that they were to buy back the land that had been sold or taken away. And this individual is willing to fulfill that role of it. But once the uh, other qualification of taking Ruth as their wife, he has some hesitancy with that. So I think what you can read from that is he probably has his own kids, he has his own inheritance, has his own family, and he's like, I really don't want to mess that up, which you can kind of understand that. But Boaz doesn't have those restrictions as much. And I think it's interesting that the one relative is interested in the land, but he's not interested in Ruth. I think Boaz is the exact opposite. Boaz could care less about the land. Obviously, he wants to fulfill what commandments there. But I think he cares more about marrying Ruth. That's his priority. So I think it's a good lesson for us, having your priorities right. I think Boaz not only wanted to fulfill the law, but he wanted to do right by Ruth. And he was willing to take on that responsibility, unlike this other relative, which, as I said before, I passed on to Eric. I could understand not wanting to complicate things for that other relative, because it seems like he already had children of his own, that could make things a little complicated. Well, yeah, Eric.
Yeah, it's understandable, but it's not virtuous is the
Yeah.
difference.
Mhm.
Boaz is virtuous. This other guy's understandable, and definitely less than. So they did at the gate of the city usually do their business. I mean, this is like law. This is the law office. This is the court. This is everything that's going on. The gate of the city is where people would spend a lot of time. Um, and a lot of these, and of course, this is a gate at Bethlehem. So this is probably not a super fancy gate. Like you get some really fancy gates at some places. Like one of the most impressive gates of all time, of course, is the Ishtar Gate at Babylon. That's a big one. You've got other gates like even like the gate at Dan. Tell Dan that's a pretty impressive gate. You've got a variety of different places that you see these sorts of big gates at, but this wouldn't even be a very big gate necessarily. But um, I do love the phrasing. It's just like so amazing. The New American Standard says, "Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz spoke was passing by." It's kind of like we would say, lo and behold, it's like the tension is great. Lo and behold, he just happens to come by, at this exact time. And this is all pointing to the providence of God, is what it's doing. These are all rhetorical strategies to highlight the importance of the providence of God, that God is making these things happen. Of course, Boaz may have known also this relative's schedule. He may have known, he comes into the city and he does business with Derek at 6 a.m., every day. And so I need to be there at 6 a.m. He's going to be there by Derek's booth, like he just knows probably what's going on. So Boaz has thought this out, but it's also the providence of God. And more importantly, it's the providence of God. Uh, Under the law of Moses, you'd have 2 or 3 witnesses. The fact that Boaz pursues 10 witnesses is just going above and beyond. And this also becomes critical because David's line will become the focus. And so if there's going to be any questions about his heritage, that could jeopardize his line. But he doesn't even have that in mind yet. But just because of what he does in creating an abundance of witnesses, he sort of vouchsafes the line. of David without even knowing. And so again, that's God's providence that's working there. That decision that was made. So 10 usually in the Bibles is the idea of completeness. Sometimes it's like over the top. And so, I've been tested these 10 days, it's like it's supposed to be almost like extremity is what it is. So they sit down. It is funny that his name's not preserved. Of course, in the ancient world, that was a big part of who you were, was getting your name preserved, getting your name carved on a wall somewhere or on a road somewhere. And so Boaz is remembered, but this other guy's so and so. I think Chris had said this guy's just Mr. So and so. It doesn't even matter who it is. The fact that this guy had not pursued the right of redemption kind of shows his cards a little bit. Naomi and Ruth have been there. People know who Naomi is. People know who Ruth is. This guy has not acted with immediacy. Contrast that with Boaz. Boaz, this door opens up and he's like, I'm going to take advantage of this right away. But this guy, he's not done anything. And then he thinks he can just sort of pawn off the personal element of the redemption and get some land off of this. And no, that's not going to happen. As soon as Ruth is mentioned, he's like, nope, not going to happen. And you know why? Because the person who marries Ruth has to provide an heir for Ruth. So if they have a son or daughters, because Zelophehad's daughters inherited land too. So Israel had prescription for female inheritance too. So whatever child they have, the heir is going to own that land. The Redeemer doesn't own the land. The Redeemer has to take care of the land until the heir can take care of the land. That's what jeopardizes his stuff. He doesn't want to decrease his assets sustaining this until the heir gets old enough to take care of it. And so again, it's understandable. If you're not going to get anything out of this, then why should you invest all this into it? It's understandable, but it's not virtuous. This was the responsibility of Elimelech's family members to take care of producing an heir from Mahlon and Chilion and all these different lines. It was his family's responsibility. His family wasn't stepping up. And sometimes that happens. Sometimes family doesn't step up the way that they should. I can think of one example where the immediate family just kind of kicked somebody to the curb. But then an aunt stepped in and helped this man with the challenges that he had. And she really went to bat for him and did everything she could for him. And she was an extraordinary and virtuous influence, whereas the man's immediate family, and I mean immediate in the sense of parents or, that sort of thing, siblings, did not. They just kind of wrote him off. And so the aunt stepped in and really did incredible things. So sometimes that happens. But of course, the focus is this. He takes his sandal off. And he says, you may have the right of redemption. So very, very interesting. Andrew?
I was just thinking that you're seeing really as the book will further unfold, just the promises of Abraham being fulfilled in this situation among Boaz and Ruth, the plans of land, nation, seed. Of course, that culminating in that line that will come not only through David, but ultimately Christ and the church. You're just seeing this being planted, that it's coming slowly to fruition. That's why it's so important that we, as stated earlier, look at the Old Testament and seeing how this is all coming about. And you could see that Boaz being very Christ-like. Will just imagine him like, well, will no one be willing to redeem Ruth and Boaz willingly is going to say, I will. It's like Christ willingly will redeem us if we just be willing to accept him. And like it's already been articulated, it's just so much of benefit to have a surplus of people to vouch for what is being done, and where there is no doubt, and that there cannot be no question as far as what took place, whether this is all in the up and up, and if anyone had anything to be presented as far as having a problem, then it would have been done right then and there. There was going to be people that arose from it, and it just speaks so well to if there's a matter that needs to be addressed, and others need to be involved. Try to do it as quickly as possible, and make sure that um, everyone that is involved is aware of the situation, and that there cannot be anything like going forward that's going to be brought back into question. And this was handled, this was settled, it was a done deal, and it's just a great illustration of how we should seek to handle things. I know it's a different culture, a different time, but we still very much seek to do principles in that way. And you just show very much Boaz is willing to submit. Hey, uh, even though it may not turn, because he doesn't know. It's not like he has the foresight of it's going to all work out, where I'm 100% going to be able to redeem Ruth. It's not as if it's a done deal. Like he knows for certain. It's not like he is given that information. I mean, he obviously hopes to do so, but it's not like it's signed, sealed, and delivered. It just goes to show that he took as our deacon last night talked about taking that step, that first step. He took a giant step into seeking to redeem Ruth. He had to be willing to do that, though. I mean, we're not told of Boaz, and you think of his character, he probably didn't have any other children, I mean, or spouse. You just think that the way that he is lived, that he wouldn't do those things. Like he understood the law. It doesn't come across as part of his character that he would know that marriage is between a man and a woman, and it's sacred, and to bring up a child, and again, just being a man, doing that which is on the up and up, and he's reliable, and he too is rewarded. And he wasn't seeking to benefit himself. You see that he's willing to be sacrificial and serve, and he's greatly blessed for it, and great example for us. Any final thoughts?
I had just glanced briefly ahead, and I in a previous episode I mentioned when we were talking about chapter 1, that I wasn't sure which one Ruth was married to, but chapter 4 verse 10 does say that Ruth was married to Mahlon specifically, and I had missed that earlier, so I just wanted to correct that. But really good stuff. And of course, we've done some overage today, getting into chapter 4. But we'll finish up chapter 4, I guess, next time, and maybe have a little bit of review time. So that's all right.
Get ready for some traditional customs with sandals next week.
Yes,
That's the to me that's the fascinating part about the Old Testament. Like we've brought up before, even going through and talking about Romans in the first century. There's just customs that we don't do now. And there's a custom we're going to talk about next week that's kind of weird you would think about, but it was common for them. So once again, going back to the procedure part, Boaz, you see this individual that is wanting to please God and do everything the right way. And obviously he had faults, but it's a good example to look at with Boaz, and it's a character we don't talk about very much. So glad we're going through this book. Good reminder.
And as we've said multiple times, and the New Testament, whether it be in Romans chapter 15, verse 4, or 2 Timothy 3, verse 16 to 17, just reinforces the fact of the necessity of looking at scripture in its totality and making sure that we know it and really study it. And we hope that by looking and studying Ruth, it just shows the benefit of us knowing the Old Testament. So many lessons for us to learn, even just from this book that's 4 chapters. And we'd be missing so much of God's story because it is about who he is, his people, how his people are to be. And this is a great book of how his children were supposed to be. I mean, so many children at that time were living far off. And here's a person that was not. He was seeking to love the Lord God with all his heart, soul, mind, and strength. And you saw just as what we read. He was loving his neighbor as himself. He was thinking about his neighbor in this instance. And so he was doing what the law required. And we should seek to do what the law of Christ requires day in and day out. And hopefully you're seeking to do that's when you get up thinking about, okay, what can I do to serve God? You just get the picture of that. That was just Boaz's mentality. What can I do to serve? And may that be our mentality. How can I show love to my fellow man and be about caring for others? And that's definitely who Christ was all about. That's who Boaz demonstrated. That's how we should demonstrate ourselves and have commanded to be like that in our lives. So we thank you as always for tuning in to these episodes. Hopefully, not just to listen to what we have to say, but most importantly, to study from the Word of God, to learn more about who the Father is, who Jesus is, who the Holy Spirit is, in order to have that right relationship, because that's what's going to get us in to the eternal home of heaven, is having that right relationship. And we're thankful for, of course, Jesus being that Redeemer, because that's what we required. And we just hopefully are living our lives in such that it demonstrates our gratitude towards or to him. And so please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have questions, whether it be what we talked about today, but even more importantly, of what it means to have a relationship with the Lord. And you can reach out to us either at the Shively Church of Christ Facebook page, where you can find Chris or Eric and myself through Taylorsville Road Church of Christ Facebook, page or at taylorsville.rdchurchchrist.com. Just please make sure that you're not taking a moment for granted, because we're never promised any time in this life. So we just got to make sure that we're always on that narrow path leading to heaven. So thanks for tuning in for this episode of Three Guys in the Word. And hopefully, Lord willing, we'll be back next week where we'll plan on, Lord willing, finishing up the Book of Ruth. But until then, may God bless you and take care.